Joining us is your friend and mine, former White House Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at Bondi Partners, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, I want to rip right into this story here that came out this week. Your predecessor at the White House, John Kelly, has sparked some controversy this week after claiming that on a trip with Donald Trump in 2018, that Trump expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler and once said, well, Hitler did a lot of good things. Now, Mick, you know Donald Trump. What do you reckon? Yeah. Surely this isn't true. And why do you think, though, that John Kelly would come out with such a bizarre story?
James, it's hard to know where to begin on this one. Let me tell you what I know. I saw that interview on the CNN network here in the U.S. and was just outraged by it. I've spent just as much time with Donald Trump as John Kelly, probably more. And I never saw that language, even that inkling that Trump was going there. And for Kelly to say this about the former president of the United States and the future candidate of the United States is simply irresponsible. Why? He hates him. He just does. He's hated him ever since he hated him while he was working for him. In fact, I've often commented I thought John stayed too long because he lost the ability to respect the president of the United States. This is a former chief of staff. In this country, this is a pretty big deal. This is a high-ranking position. I've been told it's the rough equivalent of a 4-star general in the military, and John was exactly that. So he should be taking his responsibilities as an ex-chief of staff a lot more seriously. Listen, I criticize Donald Trump from time to time. When I do so, I try to be respectful about it. John Kelly needs to do the same.
Yeah, well, indeed. And I think, we all know in this country as well the power that the chief of staff to a prime minister has as well. It's a very powerful position. But I want to move on to another story this week here, the Tik Tok story here. Now, remarkable news about the bill to ban TikTok or allow the government to make it not be controlled by the Chinese company ByteDance, I guess, in the U.S. That's passed the House of Representatives. But Donald Trump, he's been opposed to the ban, despite that, only 15 Republicans voted against it. Walk us through a bit of the debate here, because I think it might be a little bit more textured than some people are saying that it's just a straight TikTok ban.
Well, it certainly is. And it's always going to be a lot more textured in a country that has such a powerful First Amendment and free speech rights like we have ingrained in our Constitution. But the dynamic here is fascinating to me as just someone who watches politics. Donald Trump actually started the ball rolling against TikTok back in 2018, 2019, and for good reason. He was worried about the Chinese government having access to huge amounts of data on American citizens. He was also worried about the level playing field. So many of our platforms, Twitter, Facebook, are not allowed to operate in China. So Trump was saying, why would we allow theirs to operate here? That's what started this. And of course, the House and the Republicans in the House and many Democrats took it up as well, as you mentioned, and it passed overwhelmingly. Only 15 Republicans voted against it. I think a total of 65 people voted for it. So there were 350 odd people who voted for this thing. You don't find that level of bipartisanship in Washington, D.C. these days. But Trump came out against it just before the vote, and no one can seem to understand why, other than perhaps his visceral hatred of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook Meta. I think that some of this is just personal animosity between the former president and Mr. Zuckerberg, and I think that probably factored in here. You since heard Trump, by the way, slowly sort of refining his position and saying he still believes that TikTok, if it were to be a security threat, should be banned, et cetera. So he's sort of moderating his position on it today.
But Mick, how much of this is a bit of a proxy for a bigger issue? Because it's not just TikTok and their surveillance, but TikTok and their ability to pump propaganda into young people and all sorts of crazy stuff about gender and politics in the Middle East. And there's a debate that seems to be going on between people who think, as I do, that TikTok and these other tech giants like Meta need to be brought to heel for what often amounts to assaults on our society and our youth and our democracy. But there are those who say that the way this law was written, it would allow the president to say, oh, well, TikTok, it's got too much foreign influence. Maybe we ban that. Who's right here?
Keep ban it. I don't think it's entirely accurate to call it a ban. It could be,
sure,
okay, under certain circumstances. But I think the most likely thing is that it ties into what we call CFIUS, which is the investigation we do when any critical U.S. assets are being sold to folks overseas. If an Australian company buys an important American company, then there'd be an investigation as to whether or not it would be in the national interest for America to allow that sale to take place. We have a long history of this. We didn't let the Soviets buy General Motors back in the 1970s if they wanted to. So we've had these type of protections. The typical remedy, James, is that you have the company, say the Chinese company, would have to divest. They'd have to find a buyer for TikTok and sell it to somebody else. And already today, folks, including the former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, have announced that they're trying to put teams together to buy TikTok if it comes to that.
Fascinating. Now, one other thing, though, that I think is really also fascinating is the behavior of the left around Donald Trump. And I love this story because after the Supreme Court rejected attempts to disqualify Trump from the ballot in Colorado, a National Pulse poll has found that 35% of Democrat voters, so a third of them, say that if Trump wins this year's election, they would support Democrats in Congress refusing to certify the election results. Mick, this sounds very kind of, I don't know, almost a little bit insurrection-y to me here.
Yeah.
Who's fighting democracy now?
Yeah, who's undermining democracy is a great question. And this comes back to the first story we talked about with John Kelly, talking about Donald Trump in the same sentence as Hitler. You can't do that. We have to stop doing that in this country. Keep in mind, the Democrats have likened every single Republican candidate for president since Nixon to Hitler in one way or another. Sooner or later, what you get is what you saw in that polling data, which is just a large swath of people saying, you know what, to heck with elections. We don't want to certify him if our person doesn't win. And, why not? If he's Adolf Hitler, maybe they're right about that. So we have to stop doing this. And people who lose need to accept the loss. People who win need to do so graciously. Unfortunately, the country is not moving in that direction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all remember some of the stuff they tried to do to Mitt Romney, who was about the most white bread, bland person, who's ever run for president, but lovely fellow, but nevertheless. Finally, talking about democracies, I want to talk about a democracy overseas, Israel, and the rift between the Biden and Netanyahu governments. And they're at a tipping point here after a U.S. intelligence assessment publicly warned Netanyahu's leadership is in jeopardy. Now, Chuck Schumer has been out speaking against Netanyahu, saying they should basically have another election. This feels a bit like the United States or some Democrats are starting to poke their noses into Israeli Democrat processes and are a bit more concerned about Netanyahu than they are Hamas. Is this about Michigan? What's this about?
Yeah. By the way, yes, it's exactly about Michigan. In other countries, we would call this, election interference, overseas election interference. But I guess it's okay for us to do it if we don't like what the people in the other country are doing. This was a big deal today. The threat assessment was one thing. The Schumer comments on the Senate floor, which I've watched, were some of the most demeaning statements I've seen in the Senate in a long time. He talked to an elected head of state, one of our close allies, like a small child. And not in a good kind of way. So it's really surprising how quickly the Democrats are starting to flip on Israel. Yes, it comes back to Michigan. They all saw that vote tally during the Michigan primary a couple of weeks back where more than 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the Democrat primary to send a message to Joe Biden that they did like his policies in Gaza. And Donald Trump won Michigan by less than 40,000 votes back in 2016. So 100,000 is a big deal in Michigan. The answer to your question, James, is yes. This is politics. It's a shame the Democrats don't have any statesmen like they were calling for back when Donald Trump was president.
Mick, it's an absolute mess. Thank you so much for your time, and we will speak to you next week, I am sure.